Likewise, like being able to write down what's being said live is pretty unlikely. So the chances that this magazine was a magazine that Bob Marley got, opened up, read Selassie's message to the Negroes, and said what, and then was like, I have to sing this. This reached millions and millions of African people. And it also is a magazine we're going to go into a little bit about how His Majesty addressed African Americans and the subject of title and identity, in which is still an issue. And again, this interview was done with him before the Meet the Press interview, which he did a few days later, in which he spoke about racial discrimination and people being called by names of black and white, which he said should not be used. So these type of things are all intermixed in a greater perspective of race in America that's presented in this Ebony magazine. And we'll go into that one in a bit. The introduction today, I'm going to try and go chronologically so that we go somewhat 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So there is so much information about His Majesty that I have to kind of look at key and important elements. There is an amazing book written by this young man who's 25, who went to Ethiopia to cover for a Canadian newspaper. And the name of the book is Janoi. Which is a name that is also a name that refers to His Majesty, and it means His Majesty. So the name of the author is Robinson McLean, and this is a short segment out of the book, which he published many articles in Canadian newspapers to cover Ethiopia and the Italian invasion. What's remarkable about this young man is his mind is really cool because he's super young, and he's going to be a little bit excited and humorous about his excursions and his joys and his pains. But this is one of the key people that spoke to His Majesty about how the media works and how the media doesn't care about what's right or wrong often in times of war. They want to capture the blood, they want to get the gory story, and they're out. They don't have a moral perspective one way or another. And that for His Majesty as an African and as a underdog is going to have to look at how to create a narrative. Now this was nothing new for His Majesty, which we will look at later on in another book about how the coronation was also prepared for. And a lot of that was realizing that many leaders in Europe did not want to particularly pay attention to Ethiopia or show the proper respect to Rastafari when he and his delegation went to Europe in 1924. He felt he was largely ignored by several people he wanted to work with, and realized that by creating and inviting the world to the biggest event in African history and perhaps world history, that these world leaders would be lined up and, in a sense, in competition to get his attention. That he wasn't going to seek their attention, he was going to create the biggest event in which every world leader would want to either send their son or come themselves, where the press was going to be there, and that's where this National Geographic magazine comes in. So this is the 1930 November 2nd story. Because of the way that time and traveling took at the time, it took a lot of time for sometimes articles to come out. The Brethren asked me about the Time magazine, where it says His Majesty King of Kings on the cover, which came out November 3rd, 1930. This was already pre-planned, ready for press, and there isn't much an article in there because it actually hadn't happened yet. So it was more of a declaration and less of an article. The article, the cover of the Time magazine in 1936 declaring him Man of the Year, had a very interesting editorial in it. One of them was, "It is stupid and dangerous," according to the writer of the editorial, for the United States to venerate or to encourage Haile Selassie in his campaign against Italians, because you're encouraging black people all over the world to think that they can run their own governments and control their own land. And of course, we know they can't, because the way the letter went on, and said, but by doing this, you are empowering black people everywhere to look to Africa and to look at a sovereign king who's fighting against white supremacy. This is not a good idea for a country that actually is profiting off of this, and it would not be in our interest. This subject was so revealing. This letter is so revealing in his disapproval of His Majesty being called Man of the Year, that it was a subject that we saw echoed through Secret Service papers all the way up to Nixon. It was echoed to JFK when it came down to his personal relationship with Haile Selassie. Is that even Roosevelt was not at first wanting to join World War II whatsoever. And, the world watched as Ethiopia was bombed, and so the very nature of watching the a conflict of interest when it came down to a United States foreign agenda and policy and Europe's foreign agenda and policy, and the desire of freedom and liberty, human rights, and sovereignty for Africa. And this is something that we will also touch on. But in this context, this European from Canada was sent down at 25 to cover Haile Selassie. And this is one of the first days of him being in Ethiopia, and I wanted to share this particular story. When I wrote my story of the bombing of Dessie, I made a serious mistake. A mistake I made continuous, that all other correspondents made from time to time, and one that Mussolini made. I underestimated the emperor, who is known to the world as Haile Selassie, but to his people as Janoi, His Majesty. I wrote because I believed that Janoi lived in a tent in a valley away from bomb-baiting Dessie. I imagined that he went by car every night to his tent and returned every morning when the fogs lifted, to give a broad enough horizon to allow some warning of a bombing squadron. I would have said, had I been asked, that his tent was moved from week to week. Instead, the little emperor lived in the most conspicuous spot of the city, and when the bombing planes droned out of the mist, he wasn't securely asleep in some safe valley, but he had his graceful fingers wrapped around the stuttering trigger of an anti-aircraft gun. I made the same mistake earlier, when we learned one morning that the lions had escaped from their rickety cages in the old palace, killed one sentry, mauled another. We wrote a story, but none of us imagined that Janoi was anywhere but in bed. Instead of that, little Janoi, father, was out in the torchlit palace, chopping down with a submachine gun the lions that threatened his children. Thus I failed to give his incredible due to Janoi, emperor, and Janoi, father. There was little wonder how I also underestimated Janoi. Friend, except I did it so often. The record of my doubts of his friendship is shamefully long. I doubted him when he stopped the flight to Ottawa. I learned that Ottawa was in Italian hands. I doubted him when my caravan was delayed and learned of riots along the road. I doubted him when I was refused permission to go with my mules and learned of emasculations. I doubted his further interest in the fizzling expedition, received from the palace a chiding message. Quote, had I not enough faith in his friendship to ask him first to buy at full price my caravan, but must sell it on the streets like a merchant? When I returned apology to his message, only bare bones of my caravan being left, Lorenzo brought me to Chanoi's request to see me before I left. My interview was postponed twice. I started doubting all over again. Lorenzo explained, Chanoi received me only in the new palace. It meant an entire afternoon for him to change and go to the other palace in return. Twice he had been called back on the road between the palaces, once by urgent messages from Geneva, which he must answer, and once by war news from the front. Sir Sidney Barton had been asking an interview for 3 weeks. I was humbled when I had my last talk with Genoa. There wasn't much I could say since I was leaving. I thanked him as fully as I knew how. My voice and my moves were a little shaky. I realized how I could try to do something to help Genoa. I asked his permission to advise him, as well as I could go on to deal with the press. He nodded assent, and for 2 hours I lectured the little man upon the troubles he might have with correspondence and solutions I could suggest. I talked too, like a Dutch uncle, upon the fact that the world expected less of him than he thought his duty. Over and over I told him that the world would not hold him responsible for the correspondence either by his own people or by the Italian Parliament. I didn't say that he was too much of a gentleman for the world to ever really understand him, but this lay behind us. With each sentence, the bushy head nodded attention. I knew then how John Hoy had made himself what he is. I have no doubt that the only part of what I said met his approval. But the words were weighed and the ideas were studied, and with an attention so absolute that I had forgotten how long I spoke to Lorenzo. I forgot how long I spoke when Lorenzo entered, to indicate to the others who were being received on this day. Said I, because we were growing impatient. I bowed 3 times leaving, nor felt